that for an introduction, and it just kind of goes on and on and on, and I think, holy mackerel. I'm always impressed by that because I didn't mean to do any of that. I didn't mean to become or to evolve into any of the things that introduction and that biography makes reference to. A long time ago, I went to a traditional camp, and I hadn't been reconnected with my people for very long. And I was in foster care homes and adoption, and I was part of the 60s scoop, and I disappeared into southern Ontario, and I lived in a suburb of Toronto in 1965, and I was effectively cut off from everything that was Ojibwe First Nations native. And I didn't make it back into that world until I was 24. And so when I came back, I had no idea about who I was or what I was to represent or how to go about representing that. And I was in a lot of fear and confusion. I was afraid because all of my life up to that point, I'd never believed that I'd fit in anywhere, and I never felt like I did. And when I got back to my own roots, the fear was that if I didn't fit in with my own people, where was I going to go? How was I going to survive? Who was I going to become? If my own people saw all what I perceived to be all the whiteness on me and didn't welcome me back and didn't offer me a place in their circle, where was I going to go? What was I going to do? And I thought, I have to become the ultimate redskin. I have to show these people that qualify in every regard. But at the bottom of all that was a really, really deep and abiding fear that I wouldn't be counted. And I was at a camp, a cultural camp, and I was looking around, and I was getting really disheartened, and one of the elders saw that I was in a bad way, and sat and talked with me, and I said, well, you know, there's hunters over there, and they're hunting. There's fishermen over there getting ready to set gill nets out. Come on in. And I don't know how to do that. There's people making hand drums over there, and I don't know how to do that. There's people carving, and I don't know how to do that. There's people doing all manner of things in a cultural way that I don't know how to do, and I really don't feel as though I belong here. I think that I should just pack up my backpack and leave and not bother trying to. I don't know how to do any of that. I don't know how to represent myself in that way. And she took me over to a circle of older people, and we sat there, and she said, why don't you tell us how you came to be here? And for some reason, I just started talking. And I told them all about being born in a trapline camp in 1955. And I told them about the breakdown of our familial system because of residential schools and the influence of that institution on my family's lives. And I talked about being separated and put into foster homes. And then I talked about being part of that social scoop in the 60s that separated us forever from the people. And I told them about my life in that home and how I was never allowed to be introduced to anything that was remotely Aboriginal. I was never allowed to go to a friendship center. I was never allowed to do a powwow. I was never allowed to do any of those things. I was kept apart from them because I wasn't supposed to be Aboriginal anymore. I was supposed to be a Gilkinson, and I was supposed to be a Presbyterian, and I was supposed to be a forthright representative who reflected being the son of a Grand Master in the Masonic Lodge. I was supposed to reflect all of those things. I was also supposed to be incredibly disciplined and unerring in my choices because I was also the son of a career policeman. And that's what I was supposed to represent, and so my whole social education was formed around those things. And I spoke to them about abuses, physical and sexual and mental abuses in that home, and I couldn't speak up because my father was a policeman. I couldn't say anything about that because I didn't believe that anybody would believe me, so I kept all of that hurt and that pain to myself. And I spoke about how I felt like I was going to go crazy. And that at 16 years old, I was faced with the choice of either staying there and becoming as crazy as I thought I was going to go, or leaving, because then I could, and they couldn't force me to come home. And so I did. And I spoke about going to the street and having to learn how to do unskilled and untrained jobs, and being on welfare and being on the street and being homeless and all of these things that happened to me prior to me making it home. And I spoke about the connection with my family after 24 years and how hard that was to try to bridge that incredible gap of 24 years, and how it felt that my family was more like polite strangers to each other than they were blood and kin, and how we couldn't really make that gap go away, and how much that hurt not only myself but everybody. And it took me about 45 minutes. And when I finished, those old people, they all just sat there and were looking at the fire and nodding, and I thought I put them to sleep. All of them were listening. Yeah, I might as well go now. And then finally they started talking to me. And one of them looked at me and said, you know what? The way that you told this story and the way that you brought us all the way through it and took us with you on that journey, you're supposed to be a storyteller. That's your function. That's your role in our circle. And they told me about what that was. They told me how vital a process and how vital and pivotal a role a storyteller was in our circles, both traditionally and on that day and in that camp and from then on into the future. And so that even scared me more, because now they told me what it was I was supposed to do, and I had no clue. So I asked them questions. And they said, we'll teach you. You come here, you come to us, you ask your questions, and we'll give you teachings, and we'll give you stories, and we'll show you how to do it. And I need to tell you that prior to that, it would have been impossible for me to speak to a group of people in a room like this, especially when everybody's facing. It would have been impossible. For the most part, I walked around my world with my head like this, and I very rarely looked up. I didn't want to meet people's eyes. And when I finally had that role and that function, and I found that there was some substance that was both cultural, societal, philosophical, spiritual, emotional, scientific, I found all of that foundational stuff, and suddenly I had something to stand on. Suddenly I had someplace to move from. And it was amazing, because my head came up and I suddenly discovered that I had a voice that I could use. And I suddenly discovered that there were tools and techniques and tricks that I could employ to help me to learn how to communicate with people and to reach out through the form of story and bring to people, places, and gatherings the same things that my elders passed on to me. And so I left there, and I first became a storyteller in the form of journalism. I became a newspaper writer, and then I became a radio writer and a radio announcer, and then I moved to television, both as a script writer and as a television host and writer. And finally in 1994 as a writer and producer of published stories. And I've been doing that ever since. So it'll be 17 years now, working in the form of created story, spun out of nothing, conjured out of thin air, and made tangible through the publishing process, so that people can share those images that come to me, and people can share those dreams that came to me and I made real on the page. And it's very important to me nowadays to look around and see the incredible effects of technology on not only just our young people, more probably importantly our young people, but on every age group in our demographic. Even our older people are, and I mean older than me because I'm 55, so I can say that without any qualification now. Our older people, we're all using the computer. We're all Googling each other, tweeting each other. We're using all that technology to quote unquote communicate with each other. But we're sending out tweets with 140 characters and telling each other that that's storytelling and that's communication. We're sending out emails that are very, very short form because the psychological truth of emails is nobody reads beyond the 10th line. So they become really, really short, and they become blasts of words and text that don't really contain spirit. They contain intent, but they don't contain spirit. What happens when you send a message out that contains spirit is that you can see into the eyes of the person that you're talking to. You can get a palpable and a tangible sense of the presence of that person next to you and near you. You get an idea of being heard. You get an idea of being listened to. And you get a sense of the willingness of that other person to share with you once you're finished. When you send an email, you gotta sit there and wait. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. You don't want to leave the computer because in case the little ding goes off and you miss that email arriving, you don't want to do that. So you have to wait for that feedback to come electronically, and we've learned how to become dependent on that. We've learned through all of our demographics to trust that, to believe in it, to empower it, because we all sign on to it. And we've come to believe that that's our communication. But the essence and the spirit of storytelling exists at a whole different level, and we need to bring that forward in our communities and through our institutions. And librarians are my special people. Librarians are my favorite people in the whole world, because when I was out of my adopted home and I had nowhere to go but the street, the only place that I could go that was a haven for me, that was blocking off all of that madness and all of that mayhem up there in that city street living, was a library. And I went there, and I knew that within the stacks and within all those rows and rows of books was a knowledge that would give me something that I had no clue of at that present time. And I began to go there and read everything. So everything you heard in that bio, that introduction, was achieved without anything beyond a grade 9 education. I've published all of these books, and I've done all of these things, and I've never gone back to school once I left at 16 and went to the street. But there was a free academy of learning whose tuition at that time was 25 cents for a card. And I went there every day, and I read something. I used to carry a notebook in my back pocket. When I heard somebody talking about something that I didn't understand or I'd never been introduced to, I'd scribble it on my little notebook. And then I'd go to the library and I'd ask the librarian, do you have anything about this? And a lot of times what was written on that little notebook was written phonetically because I didn't know how to spell etymology. Or I didn't know how to spell nuclear, whatever, fusion, fission, whatever. I didn't know how to spell it, so I'd write it phonetically, and they'd look at it and they'd sound out the phonics and they'd figure out what it was I was after. Or the names of writers. I'd write those down phonetically, and they'd have to kind of pronounce them to themselves before they understood that I was after Lawrence Ferlin Getty. And they'd find it for me, and I'd read about it. And I went back time and time and time again, and they always gave me more and more books. And so they empowered me with the power of those stories written in those books. So by the time I did get back to my people, I had a lifetime sworn membership in the cultural books already, because I knew that that's where I wanted to exist, and that's what gave me all of this ability to do the things that I did. So when I started to look at the importance of storytelling, we need to kind of take a backward step, and we need to find storytellers that are willing to take risks in what we do. If you go on YouTube and you search Richard Wagamese, you'll find a number of YouTube videos in there of an activity that I call performance storytelling. And what that is it's a fusion of traditional techniques, traditional principles, and modern and contemporary tale telling and tale structure. And the reason that it reaches out and resonates with people is because it's captivating, and it's full of energy, and it's full of spirit, and it's full of wonder. Because that's the glue of everything. Wonder is the absolute glue and fabric of the universe. It's how we achieve things, because we always wonder. And I want to give you an example of that. I wrote a story about maybe 11 years ago. And good story. Reads really well. And I always thought that, that's it. I did a good job in that story, because what I did with it was use those old structures and those old legend elements and those old teaching tale elements and put it into this contemporary form on paper. And it reads real well. But I started to see that wasn't quite enough, that it needed something a little bit more than that. And when I looked at it, and I particularly remember looking at this audience that I was supposed to present to, I thought, I'm going to really reach out this time, and I'm going to take a risk, and I'm going to try and find that extra something that's in that story, so that those people get an idea of what I'm talking about when I say that you have to be able to reach out with everything that you have, and you have to be able to take risks as a storyteller. So here's that story in that form that it's become nowadays. You can still read it. It's Tim for Joshua. And like I say, you'll read it and go, oh, that's really well written. But read it after I tell you this. Read it after I ask you to do a couple of things with it. First of all, I'll ask you to put your cups and your papers and your folders and everything on the floor. And I'll ask you to get as comfortable as you can in your seats. Doesn't matter, there's no propriety, however you're most comfortable sitting or relaxing or lounging. And I'll ask you to not sit with your arms like this, because of what I want you to do is I want you to be able to go like this. I want you to be able to open yourself to the experience of the story. And when you open yourself to the experience of the story, it's really hard to do that if you're blocking all your centers when you're like this, or even when you're partially like this. So if you just get as comfortable as you can with a sense of openness with your body, where you can just receive. And I want you to imagine that in the middle of the circle that we sit in today is a fire. And the fire is burning, and there's orange and purple and blue at its center, and every once in a while it sends a spiral of spark into the air. And it's burning there for us, and it's burning there in the night. And I want you to imagine that we've come here together as a band of people for a couple of reasons. We came here to gather for community. We came here to gather for a sense of belonging. We came here to gather for the connection that we see as we stare across that fire and make eye contact with our friends and our neighbors. I want you to imagine that this is a safe place, and that we recognize it. Sitting by this fire, we recognize that it's a safe place. And then I want you to imagine that when the voice starts, that there's darkness, and there's trees, and there's a crackle of branches, and there's the sound of animals behind us, and we're sitting in a primordial but safe place. And the voice begins to talk. And I want you to do this for me. I want you to close your eyes and take put your hand in the middle of where your ribs join at the top of your rib cage. Put your hand there. I want you to take a really big breath and close your eyes and let it go. And do it one more time. In the long ago time, long before this country was settled, and long before the great changes that arrived here, long before there was a measure of time, long before there was a sense of history being born, receding, or coming toward us, long before any of them, when people learned to exist with the land and the spirit of the land, where the land dictated when things should be done, when things needed to be achieved, when effort needed to be expended. In those times were the storytelling times. And at that time, you can open your eyes, at that time, there was a band of people living in the great northern part of the country, where when the sun went down and the moonless nights broke full, there was nothing but the serrated teeth of the pine trees behind them in the darkness, or the humped shape of rock ridges. The call of moose from the marshes or the trill of the loons off the water could be heard all around their home. And the people would gather, and they would light a fire just like this one. And they would sit around it, and they would share food. And they would share laughter, and they would share songs. Old ones would tell legends. Old ones would share teaching tales, or they would just tell each other the stories of their day. What they saw as they moved across the land, what they smelled, what they tasted, what they touched, and what they experienced. They would share all of that in that great time. And those people in that small band lived a harmonious lifestyle. They lived in an interdependent way. They trusted each other. They had loyalty and they had honesty. They had forgiveness and they lived in a non-judgmental way. Life was wonderful. Life was full of harmony. Life was full of sharing. Life was full of community. And everything was predictable. Children were born. They were held, they were passed around those circles. Everyone cuddled those children and greeted them and welcomed them into the world. The older people watched over the young ones while they started to grow, while the older adults and older teenagers took care of the needs of the camp. So those children were loved as they grew. They were loved up. And they became strong, and they became healthy, and they became whole, and they stood tall and proud beside the rest of their people. Everything was predictable. Everything was wonderful. Everything was harmony. And the people sang and gave praise and followed their ceremonies and followed their ceremonial teaching. And then one day, a baby was born, a boy baby. And the people all gathered and ran to the lodge where this baby was born to welcome him into the world and to see his face for the first time. He was tucked in his cradle board and lined with mosses and covered with furs, a perfect brown little face. And everybody was so overjoyed. And his parents looked at this little boy and they drank in the feeling of his spirit. And his mother, when she held him, she could feel the life force in him and held him, crushed it to her. But after a while, people started to notice something. They started to notice that the baby didn't make a sound. Where the other babies cooed and gurgled and snored and made all kinds of baby sounds, this young boy didn't make a sound. And they wondered about that because nothing like that had ever happened before. Nothing like that in the history of their village had ever happened. All babies were born the same. But this young baby didn't make a sound. And as his body started to grow, he grew longer in his cradle board. It became time for him to crawl around the floor of the lodge. They found out that he couldn't do that. He would just lay on his back and not move and not make a sound. And they became afraid because they'd never encountered anything like this before. And some of the people worried. Some of the people cried. Some of the people were afraid. They didn't know what to make of it. As the other babies who were born at the same time began to crawl around and become playful, this baby didn't. And everybody was afraid. Except his parents, who always held him. Who always held him and talked to him and told him stories and just loved him. They went to the elder in their village and they said, "It's time for our son to be named." And they spent a great many hours talking to this wise person and telling her how much this boy child had brought into their lodge, how much light they had brought into their world, how they could embrace that, and how it made them feel larger inside. And the old woman went away into the bush and fasted for 4 days and came back, and they had a ceremony at the lodge, and she said to the mother and the father, "The boy's name is Lasco Nash." And they thought, what a wonderful name, because that's exactly what he brings to us. It's a perfect name for this child, because even though he doesn't move, and even though he doesn't speak, he brings that light into our world. What a perfect name. And as the other children learned to run and play, light in the sky just Sat there, couldn't move. And he got older and he got older, and by that time all the children were running into the bush and running down the trails and learning to swim in the lakes, and he wasn't making a move. And then one day while his parents were watching, they could see him almost focus all of his energy into his face, and they saw him sitting there with deliberate intent. And he began to push himself to his feet. And as he stood up, one leg turned inward like this, and one arm turned this way, and his shoulders humped up like this, and his face and his jawline slid the other way. And when he tried to walk, he did this. And his parents went, how could this happen? How could this happen? Because all of our children are born so perfect and so strong. So wonderful. But they loved him anyway. And they called the people in the village to come and see that their son had finally stood up and was able to move, and people all ran to the lodge to celebrate and welcome this new energy. And when they saw the boy standing in the middle of the lodge, some of the people cried. Some of the people were afraid. Everyone asked themselves, did we do something? Is there something that we did, or something that we didn't do? Something that we neglected that would make this happen? Everyone was afraid. And all of the children, some of them laughed, some of them teased him, and none of them played. None of them played not because of cruelty, not because of judgment, but because he just couldn't keep up to them. They could run freely with abandon, but he had to hitch along with his bent, crippled body. And he still could not speak. And as the children grew, and as he grew, he got taller, and his deformity got even more spectacular. And he had to hitch along the trails in the woods by himself, because he couldn't keep up with his friends. He couldn't keep up with them, so he became a loner. And he spent more and more time on the land, hitching along by himself, investigating, looking at things, taking time to smell things and feel things and taste things. And he came to understand the nature of the things that he found along those trails. And he really wanted to tell the people how much he was learning. He really wanted to go back and tell his community what this leaf on this tree meant to him. How this rock that he discovered in the shade of an old cedar root, how much that spoke to him and what it said to him. But all he could ever say was, and the people were always afraid. But in his heart, he found the language. In his heart, he knew exactly what he wanted to say. But his broken body and his broken vocal cords and his twisted nature wouldn't let him say it. In the summer of his 13th year, it was very, very hot. And he was sleeping in his parents' lodge. And he thought, it would be really good to go to the lake. To go down the trails of the lake and stand knee deep in that water and maybe push some up over top of me and cool myself off. It would be wonderful to do that. So he shuffled his way down to the lake, and he stood in the water. And he closed his eyes and he thought, oh, this is so wonderful. And he opened his eyes and he looked around, and the moon rose up over the top of those pine trees and the spires, the ridges of that rock, and it was round and it was orange and it was perfect and it was beautiful. And he watched it rise higher and higher, and he thought, I wish I could find a word. I wish I could find something to say to my people to describe to them how beautiful and perfect that is. There has to be, I wish I had a song. And from the south, and he went, that's it. That's the song. If I could bring that to my people and tell them, they would see that. They would know how beautiful it is. And from the west, And from the north, all four directions, from spires of rock, from ridges, that song erupted and flowed up into the night, and he stood there in the sound of it, the spell of it, with that moon shining above everything, and it filled him with such glory that tears came to his eyes because he wanted so much to say, look how beautiful it is. Look at this world and how splendid and magnificent it shines. But he couldn't. So he hitched back to parents' lodge, and he went to bed. And he counted the days until the next full moon. And when that moon came back, he went up to the lake again and stood there and watched it come up and rise above the trees, and he waited for the song, and sure enough, and he tried it. He really, really tried it with everything he had. He pushed all his spirit into his belly and tried to make that sound so he could bring it to his people. And it was, he felt so frustrated. He felt so incapable. But he tried. He kept trying, but nothing ever broke. And then the land changed. The great heat sent the fishes out of the stream. They went upstream, far away. The berries and the ferns and the mushrooms and everything the people gathered suffered from a lack of rain and dwindled and withered. The game left the bogs and marshes and the meadows, and the people became hungry. And they could smell the change of the season coming, and they knew that winter was fast approaching, and they knew that when winter came in that great northern landscape, that things would become dire and things would become hard. And without a good store of supplies and food to get them through the winter, some of them might not survive. And they became afraid. They became full of fear. They became anxious. They became desperate. And so they started to think of ways to protect themselves. And they said to each other, let's go downriver. Let's get a party together and go downriver to those people that live by the tamaracks and take their food. Let's get a party together and go downriver and invade the space of those people and take what they have so that we can survive. And they thought, that's a good thing to do. Because we're in such dire straits right now that that's a good thing to do. We'll go down there and we'll take what we need from those people so that we can survive. And so the men decided that maybe what they should do was just strike a war party. And if it meant taking lives for them to survive, they would go and they would take lives. They would make war on these people and steal their food. And Light in the Sky heard that. And in his mind, he's going, no, no, no. We are all living in grace here. And he wanted to say that. But he couldn't. And one night, the people had a fire. And they were making plans to load up their canoes and head downriver. And they were dancing and singing songs and working themselves up into the sufficient energy to go and do that. And the moon rose over top of that fire and over top of those trees. And it started to shine down like a spotlight, and when it hit their camp, there was that young boy standing in the full flush of that moonlight, standing there. And he listened to their people's plans, and he listened to their intentions, and he knew how much harm would come to them spiritually if they allowed themselves to do this thing. And in a moment of a dire, desperate choice, he raised his face to the moon and went, and the people looked, and they went, the voiceless, broken boy is singing to the moon. And he stood there and he was howling. And from the south, from the west, from the north, and from the east, stopped talking and they looked at each other and they heard this magnificent song rising in a great swelling circle all around their camp. And he looked at the boy standing in the full flush of the moonlight in the middle of it, singing that same song. And he stepped forward and he went to each of them and he took their hand and he looked at them and they were seen and they could feel it. They could feel his spirit and his warmth and his love for them and the shelter that he had for them in his need. And they were ashamed of their plan. They were ashamed of the way their thoughts had led them to this possible mission. And they could feel the full energy of that song and that boy's touch. And they were ashamed. And they laid their plans aside. And the young man made his way across the entire village. And every one of them felt touched and honored and blessed by that energy that said grace, that said protection, that said love. And when he was finished, he hitched his way to the middle of the camp, to the fire. And he went to his parents. And he laid his head on each one of their shoulders. And they wrapped their arms around him and hugged him. And when they stepped away, he began to stand up. And his shoulders straightened. And his arm turned around. And his foot and his hips regained their proper proportion. And he stood there in the full flare of that moonlight. And he raised his voice to the sky again with his arms flung wide open. And he sang it again and again and again, and the people understood that he was telling them that they lived within the full thrall of grace and harmony. And they had not a need to fear. And as he sang and he felt that belief, he leaned back into that pale blue arm of moonlight. And it lifted him up. And it lifted him higher and higher. And as that wolf song reached its crescendo, he floated right up and up and up. And they could see him come to sit in the face of the moon. And they thought to themselves, that's our symbol. That's our symbol every time we see that moon. And every time we see the face of that boy in the shadows of the moon, we'll understand and we'll remember that we're protected and that we live with grace. And there will always be enough as long as we remember that teaching. And that's what the people did. Every 28 days, that symbol of that boy's generosity rose above their village, and they looked at it and remembered, and all things returned to harmony. Thank you. That's important that you recognize that little smattering of applause, as much as it's appreciated, is not necessarily for me. It's for you. Because there are 4 principles in storytelling. One is the telling. The other is the hearing. The other is the listening, because there's a difference. The 4th one is incorporating what you feel, your reaction to it, where your mind goes, this little thing that happens to your face every once in a while, parts of that story. Incorporating, and then sharing, because that story is yours now. You can take that where you will and share it with whoever you want to share it with. So you're applauding your energy. You're applauding your ability to go like this and be open and allow that story and the energy of that story to come to you, and not block it with anything. Not block it with your judgment or your assumption or your expectation Wasn't enough romance in there. You should have found a girl. Or any of that. Just let the energy of that story come to you and inhabit you. Because when we talk about the importance of storytelling, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about that third principle, that third active principle in storytelling, which is incorporating. Incorporating. Bringing it in. Making it part of your corporeal being. Making it part of your experience, your life travel. And that's the hardest thing to do. And it's also the most important thing that we need to talk about, because we need to bring our young people and our people who have strayed away from the power of story back to that ability to bring those things into them. So how do we do that? We can't walk around and throw off all the power switches and turn off all the computers. Some of those suckers are battery operated. We can't do any of that. So we have to, in our homes and in our communities, in our institutions, in our libraries, make a space for storytelling. And not just the kind of storytelling, though I admire very much, the kind of storytelling that involves people memorizing a story and then offering it back. That's a great thing, it's a great device, but not that kind, because we're faced with more challenges these days. We're challenged with generations that have grown up with the idea of instant gratification, instant download of everything. If I want to laugh, I want to download it now. I don't want to watch it for 20 minutes and then chuckle. It's got to happen right now. If I want a message, I want to get it right away, because it's got to happen that way. That's what I've grown used to. So we need to find storytellers who are willing to take risks and take the story off the page. In the beginning, in the days of orality, there was no page. Stories were given into the air, so it was never captured on paper. We need to bring that element back. Take the stories that we have to tell off the page again and animate them the way this story was animated. Because, you know, I could have read you that story, but there's something in that translation from a printed text to orality again where it just doesn't quite leap over the boundaries. It might be the world's greatest story, it might be the world's best writing, but because you're just taking it off of there, it just doesn't leap over the boundaries. But if you learn the story and you put the text aside and you just bring your straight human energy to telling that tale, all the barriers go away. All the barriers go away, because when you gesture and when you use your voice as a fulcrum to go from pitch to pitch, from tone to tone, use your face, use your body, use all of these things that we're given to communicate with. People watch you. People look at you because they want to see what you're going to do next. They don't want to miss an inflection. They don't want to miss an innuendo. They don't want to miss a bit of theatricality. They just watch you. And in the watching is the disappearance of all of those boundaries. Because when you're watching that story unfold, and you're watching that boy's body become bent and shaped into something different, you're not thinking, oh, let's see, are they talking about autism? Or are they talking? Your head is nowhere in there. You're just going, wow. That's all you're doing. You're just going, wow. And in that three-letter word is wonder. Wonder. And the three-letter word that actually drives that sense of wonder is awe. And we've lost the awe in our relationship with story, because our storytellers have become people who are just content to translate off text and give it away. We need to encourage young people and young storytellers to be safe and just experiment and just give stories full of life, full of movement, full of vitality to each other, and learn this way, because that's how you engage with people. And my wife and I have been to gatherings, and we've sat in rooms of hundreds of people from all manner of backgrounds, not just First Nations people. We've been in conferences with church people, with social workers, they're our crew. And all kinds of people with varying backgrounds, but the thing that makes it all a common experience is when you give a story away with that level of animation, everybody becomes the same. Everybody becomes the same because it's the power of the story that brings people into you, brings people into that vitality of the story. And when you're in that process of going inward to something, you can't carry anything with you. You can't bring anything into that process because it disrupts your ability to arrive there. And that's the power of story. That's the importance of story, because we can carry our distractions anywhere. In all of this technology that we use, we can still be distracted while we're doing it. Lots of people are cooking and texting at the same time. And we know they're driving and texting, and we know they're doing all kinds of things. We were at the movies once, went to see the King's Speech. And before the lights went down, there's all the blue lights of all the iPods and Blackberries and everything. There's all these blue lights, like big blue fireflies all over the place. And people, what are people saying? I'm at the movies. Okay. And then as soon as the movie's over and the lights go up, so did the little blue lights. And people go, I'm still at the movies, just saw the King's Speech, it was wonderful. Why don't you just keep it in your pocket, go to your friend's house, knock on the door and say, oh man, so, and give that story away, because that's what stories are. They're not just these big, elaborate constructs about a boy in a time long ago in a village that was going through incredible changes and the spiritual lesson that happened. It's not about that construct. It's about we had this gathering at our house a couple of weeks ago, and people came and we had potluck dinner, and then people took turns singing and sharing stories and showing us photographs. And we got to know a whole bunch more people, and our community got bigger, and it was really a great time. That's the kind of stories we want to tell each other. Because I think one of the problems is that we take that idea of storytelling and we relegate it to something traditional, something cultural, something specific that has a teaching element to it, an entertainment element to it, all of this stuff. We give it those kind of parameters. But the stories everybody's hungry for are those common stories. Well, hey, what'd you do last Friday? Because as soon as we get together with each other, when you go to work on Monday and you haven't seen Gloria since Friday, that's what you ask. You say, hey, what'd you do this weekend? Paraphrase, subtext, tell me a story. Tell me the story of what you did this weekend. And if she says, oh, not much, you always go. Everybody does that because our expectation is for story, for like, oh man, when we went down and there was only a little bit of ice left in the lake, and we weren't really sure whether it was thick enough to get more ice fishing in, and we were really scared about doing it. But it was a nice day, and it would be nice being out in the water, so we chopped a little hole in the ice first, and we waited to see whether there were holes, and it seemed to do it. So we just chopped these bigger and bigger holes up until we got big enough one to fish in. And we had about 3 or 4 hours in there, really good fishing. It was wonderful. Made some barbecues and some hot dogs and some marshmallows on the little burner, and ate out there and drank coffee out of the thermos, and it was wonderful. It was great. That's the kind of story you want to hear. Now, man, not much, you know. Because we're so used to doing that to each other, too. Because we forget that we're the carriers of our own story. We forget that those simple things that we sometimes take for granted are awesome stories. They're awesome tales. And those are the kind of things we're hungry for. So the importance of storytelling is to not relegate them to specific corners of our experience, but just the regular, everyday things that we do, because those are the things that empower us. In my new memoir, that came out in February, at a bookstore near you, called One Story, One Song, the whole idea of that book is that that's the reality we're living in. We're living in a reality where we are one story and we sing one song. Just like all of those wolves and all of those different directions and that bent and twisted boy in the middle, they were singing one song. And so are we. And we need to remember that that's our mandate. that the more that we tell each other the stories of who we are and how we came to be here, the stronger we become collectively. And it doesn't matter whether I'm telling you or Romanian about what I did yesterday as an Ojibwe, or vice versa. It doesn't matter about that. It just matters about what we did and what we experienced. Because we forget our commonalities. We forget things inside of us that make us the same are a whole lot bigger and more powerful than the things outside of us that make us different. Things like skin, things like inflection, things like upbringing, all of those things that we say make us different aren't as powerful and aren't as important as those things we carry inside us that make us the same. And one of the things that makes us the same is storytelling, because we're animals. All of us, human beings, are animals. And we have this really incredible blessing because Creator in grace gave us two gifts to work side by side. One we share with animals. One is the ability to dream. And people say, well, do animals dream, Richard? And I say, well, in the middle of winter, when there's a really good fire in the wood stove, and my dog is laying on a dog cushion in front of me, she's got her eyes closed, she's laying there, next thing you know, the legs go. And the lips curl and so on. She's dreaming about chasing a rabbit, chasing a fox, running somewhere, having dog fun, dreaming. So I know that animals dream because my dog is evidence of that. But what separates us is that when they wake up, my dog wakes up and looks at me after one of those dreams, she's like, because she doesn't know what to do with it now. Now she's awake, she remembers the dream, but it's like, we're the animals. We're the animals who can wake up from that dream reality and look at each other and go, wow, I just had the most amazing dream. I dreamt I was floating on this cloud that was shaped like a pirate ship, and we were going across this big blue ocean and there were dolphins diving along. We have the ability, because of our gift of language, to tell our dreams to each other. And those are the two things that make us the same. It doesn't matter, again, whether you're Romanian, Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, Russian, Fijian, a native of Tonga, it doesn't matter. You still have those same two gifts. And when we use them in concert with each other, we bring all of that collective energy together. And it actually doesn't come to one point. It comes into a number of points that spin like this, in this great circle of creative, nurturing, and healing energy, because that's the way the energy of the universe moves. And when we bring that together in a good-hearted way, it can't help but join in that free-flowing, nurturing, healing circle of energy. And that's what I mean by collectively we all get empowered. When we say in our speechifying, in our orations, in our messages to each other as First Nations people, when we're finished, we have a tendency to say, all my relations. And then we sit down. And we need to remember that when we say that the key word in that blessing is all. It's not relations. It's not my, it's all. And that means not just the people who sing like me, eat like me, talk like me, walk like me, look like me, dress like me, behave like me, live where I live, do all the things like I do, but all my relations. And if we're all part of that great wheel and circle of creative and healing and nurturing energy, that means everybody. So when we start to talk about the importance of storytelling, it's about bringing that idea into our communities and our schools and our libraries and our institutions so that we can start to bring everybody into that. That's the true importance. That's where things change, and that's where things become stronger, and that's where things develop an adhesion to each other. I like that word, adhesion. It means glue, it means ain't coming apart for nothing. And we need that so much. We need that sense of adhesion in our life because we're shown by the immediacy of communications that things are so impermanent. Everybody has a delete button on their computer. Oh, don't like that. Delete. Becomes so easy. But if you have adhesion, if you have glue, it's really hard to delete that. And if you come together and that glue is comprised of your idea of us as a human family, and us as a generation and generations upon generations of brothers and sisters who have been part of that same energy, that same creative energy all the time that we've been here, it's pretty hard to press delete. Because now we have to incorporate, we have to bring into our knowledge and our sense of being the idea of that shared human history. And we can't believe anything. It's really hard. You can try, but you just make yourself miserable. I know, I've written it. And that's what the importance of storytelling is. And what I'm hoping to do for my own project in the next little while, and I just got back from the University of Victoria, where I brought this to third and fourth year writing students, is to take that idea of orality and harness it to the process of the written word. In fact, that class was called From the Oral Tradition to the Written Word. And for the first 6 weeks, writing students in their graduating year didn't get to write. Should have seen that. First day, here's the rule. For the first 6 weeks, you don't get to write anything. And they're like, started this, well, what? Gotta change. I gotta drop this course. I don't know how to not write. What am I supposed to learn here? And then I told them, we're going to start with orality. We're going to start with telling each other stories. We're going to start with reaching into us in our common experience and finding things that are stories to give to each other. And they're still looking at me like, this guy is weird. Until I told them this. There's a magic moment that everybody shares. And we forget about it because we take it so much for granted. Because we get this gift going and it makes us forget. But there's a common moment. We're little babies and we're laying there. And one of the things that's wonderful about being a baby is that you're introduced to magic right away. Because everything is magical. That's why babies have this look. Because they can't believe what they're seeing. It's like, wow. And they're filled with wonder, and they're laying there looking around like this. Can't believe what they're seeing, and they can't believe what they're hearing, all this stuff. Wow. And there's a little part of their brain that acts like a tape recorder. I'm not a linguist or a scientist, so I can't give you the exact physiological definition of what that is. But I know it acts like a little tape recorder, and it records all these snippets of sounds. And it records all these snippets of sound that particularly individual sound really cool to us. And that's why, every once in a while, my son Joshua, his first word was bus. That's all he said for like days and weeks. He'd just say bus. Because he'd stand there or lay there, we'd be holding him and he'd see a big bus go by and it would catch his attention because it's so big and shiny. And so I'd always say bus. So he could, in his tape recorder, he'd go record it and then he'd try to mimic it and what came out was bus. Big, long, about 16 S's. And we memorize and we mimic those things that sound especially cool to us. My first syllable was fish, like that sound. And it was fish. And that's what we do. And we keep recording all these little snippets of stuff. And that's why we speak in woos and gahs and little gurgles. And sometimes we say mama, papa, and all. And no kid I've ever encountered in all my life ever went dirigible. Never. Mama, papa, doggy, all of that. But, And that's what comes out of us. We're memorizing all this stuff. And so we're getting closer and closer to the magic moment. And the magic moment comes, and nobody has ever given an adequate description why this happens. No linguist, no scientist, no neuroscientist, no cognitive scientist, nobody, no speech pathologist has ever been able to quantifiably say, this is when it happens, or this is why it happens. But there's a moment when something happens, and language, the big switch of it, is thrown for us. It's just thrown, and all of a sudden, we can tell people what we just saw. And we can tell people what we just touched, what we just smelled, what just happened, what was going on. All of a sudden, it's like it's there. And once that switch is thrown, we get crazy with it because it's like, wow, look what I can do. So look at this. This is what happens to all of us. Somewhere in our collective memory, we all had this moment. We run into the kitchen. We run up to our parents. We're about this tall. We run up to our father or our mother and we yank on their apron strings or sleeve of their jacket and they go, what? And we go, you won't believe what happened. Yeah, Jimmy, we're down at the playground. We're having this contest on the swing to see who can swing the highest. And we're really pushing and pushing. And Jimmy's really going hard. And I have to push really hard to catch up to him. And we're getting way up there. I look back over my shoulder and I'm starting to see the crossbar on the swing. And I'm thinking, we're higher than anybody has ever swung in the whole history of the world. Are we ever high? We're higher than even the birds, huh? And Jimmy's looking at me, and he's laughing, and I'm laughing, and he tells me as we're coming by, he says, I'm going to jump off when this gets closer to the ground, and I'm thinking, don't do that, you'll kill yourself. He jumps off, and the swing starts swinging all by itself, and it's spinning, and the chain's spinning around and around, it's way out of control, and I'm looking back over my shoulder, and the swing is going crazy, and Mr. Collins is pushing the baby carriage down the path, and the swing goes out of control, hits him in the back of the head, and knocks him down, and he loses control of the baby carriage, and it starts rolling down the gravel path toward the intersection at the end of the park where there's a big truck coming down the hill and another car coming this way, and we're thinking, oh my God, everything terrible is going to happen, the baby's going to shoot into the intersection, it's going to be terrible, and so everybody starts running, I'm running, Jimmy's running, Mr. Collins gets up, and we're all running down the path, trying to get the baby carriage, and the preacher from the church is over there, and a couple teachers in the high school, and some mothers with their own kids, leaving their own kids in the sandbox, and we're all chasing the baby carriage down the sidewalk because we want to avert this horrible accident that we all know is going to happen, and we're running as hard as we can, and everybody's screaming, and there's nothing we can do, and it seems like time is picking up, and we're going faster and faster, but we're running slower and slower, and a squirrel runs up from behind a pine tree, and I leaped over it so I wouldn't crush it, and I tripped and I fell down, and Mr. Collins was right behind me, he tripped over me, and as he fell through the air, his hands came down on the handlebars of the carriage, and everything was okay. And your parents just look at you and go, three minutes? Wow. Your own kids will do that too. Well, they'll just go off and go, and while they're doing that, you can't take your eyes off. They're going on and on and on about all this fantastic stuff, and you're just going, wow. And they're showing you, in that moment, they're showing you the pure, unencumbered fear, unencumbered lack of fear in telling a story. Spontaneously, out loud, embellished, theatrical, full of action, draws you right in. That's what you don't bring anything into that process with you. You don't say, oh, that was a mixed metaphor. I'll correct them on that later. You don't do that. You just follow it right into the heart of the story and you're in there. And at the end of it, you just go, wow. And see, the sad thing about that is that we go through this whole process of unlearning that. We go through this process of forgetting that we know how to do that. Each and every one of us knows how to do that because when all of this started for us, that's what we did. We were jabbermouths and we loved it. Couldn't get enough of it. Just whoa. But then the rules started coming. Then we had friends and there was peer pressure. Then there was expectation. Then there was this whole thing with grammar and punctuation and all of that stuff. And that ability to just free flow with that story got smaller and smaller. And eventually, we forgot how to do it. I've been in rooms and I've asked people to tell a story and they're like, get so afraid. Because they're afraid of all of the stuff that they learned that helped them to forget. They're afraid of all of that because they think if I start, people are going to think it's a dumb idea, that's stupid, it's not very good. And it starts. And as soon as the self-doubt, the self-judgment, and all the repetition of history starts in our own ears, we can't possibly tell a story. But at the very heart of us, along with that energy that joins us, is that ability to use those two tools to reach out and create community and create belonging. So, if you were to go back to your organizations and your institutions and your libraries and your communities and your homes, I would say that the easiest way to empower active and engaging storytelling is to just start doing it yourself. Your family sits down, your husband comes down, you sit down together to eat, and instead of doing what you're doing, tell him a story. Tell him what you did that day. Even if he doesn't listen. Tell the story anyways. Because you're getting better at it. Every time you do that, you get better at it. And eventually, maybe one of these days, you're doing the same thing and he's still... You'll use a word from your experience and it'll catch his ear and he'll go, and you'll have them. But you have to keep on doing it, and you have to really want to re-engage that beautiful, creative, spontaneous energy that lives in you. And when you have kids that come to your libraries and you give them books and you show them all of these things, tell them something about what that story is about. But don't just tell them, oh, it's this little guy who learns how to take the feathers off a partridge so he can cook a meal for his grandma. Don't tell them that. Say, this is all about how to learn how to use your fingers. How to use your fingers and your hands to make something magical happen for somebody. It's all about this little boy who learns how to cook his grandfather's favorite meal. Try it, you'll like it. And because when you do that with the young spirit returns to the original spirit. Wow. Okay. You mean that? That's why, this is really amazing, that's why the guy who wrote the series of children's books, Walter the Farting Dog, the biggest selling series of children's book in history, Walter the Farting Dog. And the guy is a gazillionaire now because he wrote 3 of those books, and he knew that there's elemental lessons in each one of the books that makes them really charming, but he knew that just that approach, because as soon as you say that to a kid, and you have their attention because they don't want to let that go. And he knew that that's what would happen, and he infused those stories with something really, really, really special. And that's what you need to do. You need to engage that spark again. And I've discovered in all this time of working with story and all these different forms, is they have their own resonance. When I did newspaper stories, when I did radio stories and TV stories, it wasn't all so much what I brought to the process. It wasn't my ability to be a really, really good journalist or a really good television producer or whatever. It was the fact that the story had within it its own resonance. And my responsibility was to find out what that resonance was and to give it to somebody else. It wasn't about my interpretation, it was about my thinking about the story, because that wasn't going to win anybody over. But if I found the resonance within the story itself and gave people that, it became memorable, it became watchable, listenable, repeatable. Everybody shared it, and it had a life of its own, and that's what we need to do. We need to give stories a life of its own. So when I took that story off the text of my own book, and I gave it everything that you've seen here, and I've done that in a few places now, there was a lot of risk involved for me, because I'm a little disabled. One of my arms was hung the wrong way for years, and the muscles with it. And I chose to go beyond that and let that be part of the story because it was powerful. So there's some risk taking involved, and when you do it, when you take that risk, it just drives that. Because that story wasn't about me. That story wasn't about the faces that I could do or how I could generate image. It was about the resonance within the tale itself. It was about those things that touched you, however they touched you. Some of you cried, some of you were smiling, some of you had your eyes closed and you were peaceful. The way that it resonated with you, the resonance within the story itself, that's what was important. I'm just the channel. I just have the energy some days to get up and touch that resonance and give it away again. And every time you do that, that resonance spreads out, because now there's 30 more people who have had that experience. And as I said earlier, you can take that now and go and take it wherever you choose to and give it away to other people. And the way that you do it isn't the way that you repeat a comedian's best lines. Oh, and then he said, you take that incorporating process and you get in touch with it, you remember it, and you say to your family, hey, you want to hear this story that I heard at the library's services conference? You want to hear that? It's a really good story. And they say, yeah. And then you just remember. And you start to say, way back when there was nothing. And you just build it on your own. So there's no way to tell that story wrong if you get in touch with its resonance. There's no way to leave an important part of it out if you're in touch with its resonance, because it becomes your story. And your experience with the story and the way that you give it back is where you get the opportunity to put some of your spirit into it, and the people that you touch are touched with the resonance of the story and the resonance of your spirit in it, and combined it becomes unforgettable. You become unforgettable. And then they tell a friend, and they tell a friend. And it just gets bigger and bigger. And that's the important thing. So we need to start telling each other stories. We don't have to just go on this big mission to bring storytelling back. Because we don't need to do that. We don't need to bring anything back. We just start telling each other stories all the time and re-empowering that original energy that makes you talk for hours and hours non-stop and hardly taking a breath, so people go, wow. That's what we need. Not. That's kind of silly. It seems silly to me anyway. And I just want to end with this. What I'm talking about is the fundamental lack in our societies, again, wherever you come from, of this incredible moment. We robbed ourselves of this. And I, for one, am going to go on a campaign, starting when I get home, to bring that back into my own little circle. And that's this. You're on the telephone. You phone your friend. You haven't seen him for a few weeks, maybe a few months. And you say, hey, I really want to talk to you. I want to catch up and I want to tell you what I've been doing, but I'm busy right now, but I'm going to phone you on Sunday at 7 o'clock. And your friend goes, oh, okay, good. Goes to the fridge and writes down Sunday, 7 p.m. Richard's going to call. Puts a little line on it. Cool. And it's Monday, or it's Wednesday. So he's Thursday morning, you get up and you look at the refrigerator and you see that little sign there and you go, oh, wow, yeah. My friend's going to call on Sunday. Get a little excited. It's going to, oh, looking forward to that conversation. Friday comes along and it builds a little more and you go, oh, 2 more days until I get to talk on the phone. Saturday comes and you're like, oh yeah, tomorrow that phone call's coming in. It's going to be great. Sunday, you're like, oh, can't even watch the NFL. You're waiting for 7 o'clock to come for when the phone will ring. And when the phone rings at 7 o'clock, you run right over to it and you pick it up. And you grab it, and as soon as you say that first word, you say hello, something wonderful happens. Because all of that expectation and all of that waiting builds into that moment. You say hello, and the other person says hello, and there's this big pow. And you're connected. And you spend half an hour or 45 minutes lounging around and laying on the couch and laying on the floor and gabbing away, and you're laughing and you're reconnecting, and it's powerful because you gave yourself the expectation of it. Or the same thing happens when you say to somebody, oh, I dropped you a letter in the mail, should be there by Friday. Well, you're a mess up until Friday morning because you're like, what's in the letter? And then you get the letter, you gotta rip it away. You get really careful to rip it so you don't rip the writing inside, and you open it up, and there you are sitting with this letter, and everything else disappears because you sit there and you live with what's on that paper. And we don't do that with each other. We don't do that with each other, or very, very rarely. And that's what we need to bring back. We need to bring back that expectation of story and that expectation of connection. And if we can do that, we can heal a whole lot of things. We can recover from a whole lot of things, and we can nurture a whole lot of things. And it's very, very core That's what storytelling is all about. It's about nurturing and empowering and healing. But we need to bring back the long form, not the 140 character form. We need to bring back the long form of that and empower people to tell those stories. So bring storytellers into your libraries, but ask them to bring them alive. Ask them to bring them alive. Bring their spirit, put their spirit into it, and really drive those stories so that people look at the storyteller like this. Because that's what you want. That's that sense that you want, not only as a storyteller, but as a listener, a hearer, an incorporator, and a sharer in the future. You want to be sitting there going, wow. Any questions? Please.
Can you be able to read the 4 teachings?
Oh, 5, yeah. Telling, hearing, listening, incorporating, and sharing. Very quickly, the difference between hearing and listening, because I know that's coming. Always is. When you hear, you don't use your ears. When you hear, your ears aren't included in the process. It's somewhere around here, right in your middle, where your spirit lives. That's what you hear. And it comes alive, and you can actually feel yourself being touched by those words and affected by those words. That's what hearing. When you listen, you use your ears, and the only sound you can hear is the wind going in between this one and that one. So if you listen to a lot, in a crowd with a lot of political speeches, it's like it's all full of wind. It's going right through there. Nobody's really hearing it. And that's the difference. It's a spiritual kind of attraction to the words that are being told.
I'm a dancer. I teach dance. And for years, I would be, first I tell a story about how a particular dance came to be. I remember this one summer I had 12 students, and I did this story, and then I put the music on, and then got them to dance, and none of them could hear the music. So I tried it over and over again, and I realized, and to this day when I watch, I realized, so then I had to add another story in about how we listen here, how we hear from here, as opposed to, so now when I watch dancers, then it's really obvious, it's really clear between those that listen here or hear here. Good.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Well, I just want to thank you for coming on behalf of Westmark and all librarians. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, I right now I'm sort of, the only word I have is wow. Thank you very much. I think there was a couple of librarians who brought a book or two they were hoping you would sign.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, great. So once again,
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks. That's all right. Shake. Shake.